going to be great.
Beautiful. Hello, hello, hello. Welcoming everyone into the room. We'll give you a few minutes to settle in. We're happy to be hosting you today for Our City, Our Stories, a discussion on commemoration in the public realm. Just give everyone just a few minutes to arrive. We have an active Q&A, so feel free to send your questions into the Q&A as you arrive. Wonderful. Great. Well, in the spirit of time and using most of our time for the wonderful conversation that we have waiting for us here, I am going to formally open this session. We are hosting, again, Our City, Our Stories, a panel discussion on commemoration in the public realm. We're hosting through Monumental Projects in partnership with the City of Toronto. Just so you know, we are recording the session. We will be posting this panel discussion to toronto.ca later on, so it will be available for replay. I now have the pleasure of introducing Ben McIntosh, who's the acting manager of cultural partnerships at the City of Toronto, who's going to be opening the session for us. So Ben, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ariel. So before we begin tonight, I just want to acknowledge that the land that we're meeting on is a traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So this is the land acknowledgement for where I'm currently sitting, which is on the west side of downtown, not too far from City Hall. But I realize tonight we have people joining us from all across the city and across the Greater Toronto Area and possibly even beyond. So you may find yourselves under different traditional territories, but regardless of where you are and where you call home, I encourage you to take a moment tonight to think about the Indigenous past, present, and future of the land you call home. So before we begin tonight, I want to give you a quick overview of what the city's Recognition Review project is all about and what we're going to be talking about tonight. So the Recognition Review project examines how the city honors history in public spaces, and in particular, how we commemorate public figures and events in monuments, street names, and place names. So this project was kicked off in the summer of 2020 when the city received a petition calling for the renaming of Dundas Street. City Council directed staff to investigate options for how to respond to the petition, but at the same time, take a broader look at how we name streets, parks, and civic buildings, and how we represent history and monuments. The idea behind this broader review was to develop a more equitable and community-centered approach to naming and commemoration. This work was also happening against the backdrop of global protests around racial justice and reconciliation. And there were a lot of really important conversations that are happening that summer about the meaning behind street names, place names, and monuments. These questions, though, while they came to a forefront that summer, were certainly not new. They've been brought up for many years by activists across communities, by Indigenous communities and partners, and by many others as well. So when we talk about commemoration, what I mean by this is the intentional act of acknowledging the memory of people, places, and events. It includes positive and honorific celebrations of the past and the present, but it can also refer back to the tragic and controversial and shameful dimensions of history and culture. Public commemorations, and that includes street names, monuments, heritage plaques, these reflect community values by how we choose to collectively honor the past and shape the future. A commemoration is different from history. So if you're looking at reviewing or changing a street name or monument, this isn't about an act of changing history, but rather it's about how we remember those events. You might remove a street name or a monument, but history stays the same. It's always part of the historical record. Rather, though, commemorations are really about how we honor and celebrate those moments in the public sphere. So as part of this work, we're developing draft principles for guiding and draft guiding principles for naming and commemoration. I'm just going to very briefly walk you through what those principles are. The idea is that we'll take these principles and be able to apply them when we're naming new city streets or parks or buildings, and when we're looking to build new monuments. So a first core principle that we'd like to explore is the idea of Indigenous placekeeping. So regardless of the nature of the work that we're doing, we want to make sure we're honoring and recognizing the past, present, and future presence of Indigenous peoples on the land. We also want to acknowledge diversity our strength as a core principle. And this is the City of Toronto's motto, which you may be familiar with. We want to make sure we're bringing this model to life through our naming and commemoration practices by being sure that we're reflecting the diversity of communities living in Toronto, and that we're prioritizing telling the stories of underrepresented communities, including Indigenous peoples, Black communities, and other racialized groups. Relevance to Toronto is another important principle, and we want to be, by this we mean that we want to ensure that the names we select for public spaces have a clear connection to Toronto's history and culture. And we'd also like to celebrate untold stories. So being sure that we're celebrating lesser known or untold stories that you might not see in other place names or monuments. So making sure really celebrating the diversity of stories and histories that are out there. If you'd like to move to the next slide, please. Some additional points relate more to the process of how we go about naming and commemorating. And we'd like to explore the idea of co-creation, which means that we'd like to collaborate in a meaningful way with communities to select names that are significant to them. Demonstrated community support is another important guiding principle for us. So we want to be sure that we're selecting names that communities broadly support, and that we gather that support from a broad range of voices and perspectives. We'd also like to follow a guiding principle of using historical and community research to ground our decisions around names. So making sure that we've conducted appropriate research into the appropriateness of a name that includes both historical research as well as oral histories and traditional knowledge from communities. And lastly, we want to be sure that all the work we're doing complies with all appropriate legislation, bylaws, and policies to ensure that any proposals are abide by human rights and anti-harassment and discrimination legislation, bylaws, and policies. So when we're applying these principles, the idea is that we would, as we're working through a proposal for a street name or a property name or a new public art and monument, we would take the guiding principles and apply them to understand whether or not something is a good fit for commemoration in the public realm. So we've been doing a lot of work over the last few weeks to listen to get feedback from communities, doing some really fantastic community conversation circles in partnership with our friends at Monumental. We also have a public survey running right now to seek further feedback on the principles. We'll be taking all the feedback that we get through our conversation circles, the survey, as well as our event tonight, to help refine and adjust the principles to make sure that we're writing something that resonates with you and that can be used as an appropriate guide for as we move forward with this important work. I'll now hand it back over to Ariel and Zara to continue with the main event for the evening.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. Well, welcome everyone, and thanks for that context, Ben. I'm Zara Ibrahim, and I'm the co-founder of Monumental Projects, and I'm your moderator for this evening. And hopefully you will be hearing very little from me because we have an incredible group assembled tonight to reflect on this idea of recognition and commemoration in our city. And so Ben gave great context, so I'm not going to say a lot more, but what I will say is that as having the privilege of facilitated conversations with equity deserving groups and Indigenous rights holders across our city over the last few months, we've learned that names matter. And it's not only the names themselves, but it's the process and the outcomes, how we get to names and what we recognize. And, we've heard beautiful things and about, how we always talk about people and how we need to broaden the aperture to values, to the creatures, to the spirits and energies and young people and so many more stories that don't get told in our cities and communities that give us a sense of belonging and that give us a sense of place. And so we have assembled an incredible group of panelists to have a conversation and a dialogue about commemoration and recognition. And we'll touch on things related to the principles, but really why it matters, how we should feel, and a broader aperture for how we can think about the stories that get told in the city. So just one logistic before we get started for all of you wonderful folks tuning in on this beautiful evening where the sun is shining in Toronto and you're spending your evening with us. So we do want to hear from you. There's a Q&A function. And instead of an open Q&A at the end of this session, Ariel and I will be moderating the Q&A and we'll be pulling your questions into the dialogue with the panelists. So please, as soon as the panelists start giving their remarks, please start using the Q&A so we can start fielding some of those questions and bringing them into the conversation. The format for this evening is that we're going to go around the circle. We're going to have each of our panelists take a few minutes and reflect on what commemoration has meant to them in their work, in their life, in their experience of living in the city, and then to share a little bit more about the histories, stories, and anything else they'd like to see recognized in our city through the recognition that Ben discussed earlier of our public monuments and assets, roads, streets, all of those great things. Then we're going to open into a broader dialogue, and that's when we'll be pulling from the chat and fielding all of your questions. So please use or pulling from the Q&A, so please be active there. And so what I'll do is I will quickly introduce the panelists. You have registered through the Eventbrite, so you have read their incredible, esteemed bios. But I'll just do a quick introduction to them, and then we'll pass it to Elder Catherine to start us off. So Ariel, can you go to the next slide, please? We have Catherine Tomaro, who's a Wendat artist and elder from the Little Spotted Turtle Clan of the Wendat Confederacy. We also have Bonnie Devine, a member of the Serpent River First Nation, who's an installation artist, video maker, curator, writer, and educator. Faison Khan is a public space fellow at the Bentway Conservancy. And Melanie J. Newton, Dr. Melanie J. Newton, who's an associate professor of history at the University of Toronto. So welcome, panelists. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And Elder Catherine will pass it to you for a Thanksgiving address and your opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to start by introducing myself in Wyandot. Tomeshra Ijatsi, Ndata Jaton, Ngyawish Hati Yorunk, Toronto, Indare, Wendat Ndi. So my name is Catherine Tamaro, my Wyandot name is Tomeshra, and my clan is the Spotted Turtle Clan. I'm a citizen of the Wyandot of Anderton Nation, which is now located in Michigan, was once in Ontario, and we are part of the Confederacy, as was mentioned, the Wendat Confederacy. I'd like to start by offering the Thanksgiving address in Wyandot and English. And the reason that we do this is to acknowledge and greet and thank the natural world, which helps put us in a space of gratitude and thanking for all of the business of the evening. The Thanksgiving address is pivotal to us, and it is the foundation of all of the business that we conduct. It is a life way in itself. It is an address as opposed to a prayer, and it is a way, as I mentioned, of setting your mind to a space of gratitude. I'd like to kind of just dive in and discuss the first question, which is the aspect of naming and what my experience has been with it, not only within this wonderful committee, but also in my life as an Outrahon, which means faith keeper in the Wyandot language, and the conventions of naming that we practice there. I'm not going to go into ceremonial detail, of course, but I will tell you that naming, I believe, is an incredibly profound anchoring activation. It connects us to time and space. It connects us to thought and memory. It connects us to spirit and our ancestors, and it connects us to their memory as and their resonant energy as it is imbued in the land. As a faith keeper, I am called upon to help organize, facilitate, and bring forth names for young people, for old people, for infants, for those who are close to dying, for people in all phases of life who are experiencing all kinds of spiritual awakenings, deepenings, understandings, and thought forms. Naming, I think, is an incredible way to anchor one in community. But I also believe that we need to remember that community is extended to all beings in the natural world. All beings are our kin, all beings are our relatives, and we live in a working relationship with every aspect of the natural world. So I believe that when we are naming, we are invoking that service, if you will. We are honoring, but we're also asking to connect with everything that we remember, everything that our ancestors remember, every word of the language that the trees and their descendants remember, and every molecule of water, every diatom, every chrysophyte, every being in a lake, no matter how large or how small, what kind of community or singularly, naming is an essential part of being. I think also one of the aspects of naming that has been so important to me is the connection to time. Time is marked by the moon in our world. Time is marked in so many different ways. And when we resuscitate those ancestral names and or honor the features of the land, we are connecting to that ancestral energy, which is there, apparent, and ready for us to, again, to ask to work on our behalf. And again, we're also honoring those spaces. In terms of the committee and ways in which names and commemoration are important, I believe that they're both civic and spiritual, that they bridge that gap between touching people's hearts and changing signage, that they take us to places, they activate thoughts in our consciousness, they change our way of thinking, they put us in a space of good mind, which is so essential to living in a community of, close to 5 million people in the Greater Toronto area. And they also honor the incredible history of this space, as has been mentioned, which includes so many diverse Indigenous peoples, so many peoples from all over the world, and it anchors us in that continuum. So when we're naming, I believe we're touching the past, honoring the future, and stabilizing ourselves in the present, if you will. So thank you. Those are my opening comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elder Catherine, and thank you for the Thanksgiving address as well. I have a page of notes already, so I'm just going to quickly just reflect a couple of things. You talked about our community, right? The creatures, the natural elements, and the beings. And a colleague and a friend of mine said to me recently, in the spirit of decolonizing their own practice, they talked about, when we talk about sense of belonging, in this in the Eurocentric context, we always talk about it with people. And we need to expand that aperture to cultivate a sense of belonging and right relations with those elements. And you don't need to learn that because communities have name-giving traditions. They have, processes, traditions, approaches to recognizing. And even as I was listening to the Thanksgiving address, I was thinking about our elder brother, the sun, who's been shining on me. I've got paper all over my windows. And so it's such a beautiful bridge into the conversation that we'll have, because I think we talk a lot about the what, and we don't talk a lot about the how, and communities all over the city have processes that they already sort of engage in to commemorate and recognize. So thank you for all of that wisdom. Bonnie, can we go to you next?
For sure, for sure. I guess I'm going to speak a little bit personally, if I may. I grew up in Toronto in the 1950s and 60s, and it wasn't easy to be an Indigenous person during those times. As a young girl, I observed that we, meaning Indians, were considered to be a problem segment of the population with nothing to offer, and certainly nothing to celebrate or be proud of. So mostly growing up, I didn't speak about my family background or my native roots to teachers, friends, or strangers. My parents encouraged me and my brother and sister to try to blend in, to do well in school, and to keep out of trouble. Examining the issues this panel is discussing today would definitely have been considered stirring up trouble when I was a kid. But things changed for me when I grew up and became a visual artist and educator. I began to see that my presence here in Toronto wasn't the problem. And I began to investigate the history and geography of this place and the original people of it. Over the past 30 years, I've made many commemorative installations in museums and galleries around Toronto, recognizing and acknowledging that history. It's a kind of parallel vision that I see. It's being in two places at the same time, kind of the bustling, busy, progressive city of Toronto, and another vision that I have in my mind of its original place and beauty. I've learned to be proud of my history, the history of the Indigenous people here. And I've learned to love this place, the beautiful Lake Ontario, the ravines, and the rivers that feed those ravines, the trees and the people and the animals that live here in this place called Toronto. One of the questions we were asked when we were preparing for this presentation was, what histories and ways of being would I like to see honored in Toronto? That's a really good question. I would say that I'm not interested in erasing the existing colonial names here in Toronto, because I believe that they contain important memories and traces of the history of this city. And I believe those traces have meaning, both positive and negative meaning, for many citizens, including me, and should be preserved. However, I would like to see, alongside those monuments of the British Empire, meaningful mention and gestures toward the many thousands of Indigenous people who made their way here, who made a home here, and whose ancestors have lived here on these lands for tens of thousands of years. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. Again, my hand's going to be tired. And you reflected so much of, we listened to so many community members, and people said, if you're going to take down a monument, tell the story of why and how and who, the collective story of the people who came together to change that. And that's part of the story. That's part of the legacy. It's part of the history. And, as you were talking, there's been all this debate. Do names matter? Like, should we think about all sorts of other things that we need for our city, which is true. But, as you were speaking and talking about, thinking about, you were a problem, right? Like, you don't get into trouble. Made me think of what Elder Catherine was saying, which was names actually help us be seen and get into what Elder Catherine was saying is a state of good mind. So that we can, James Baldwin style, stir up some good trouble. So I just really think that, you touched on that space of good mind and the why, right? Like why do we invest our time in this? So thank you for that. Faison, your turn.
Hello, it's my turn. I really appreciated, Bonnie, what you were saying, because a lot of that resonated with me. And for context, I'm a new settler on these lands. I arrived here 7 years ago from the Middle East, and my family settled here in Scarborough, to the east of Toronto. And so I'll talk a little bit about my experience with commemoration, and my experience is very tangential in that, you know, I have nothing to do with naming, but other forms of commemoration sort of more broadly. And so when soon after moving here, or soon after arriving here, I started studying architecture in my undergrad. And because of that, I was consistently engaging in topics of architectural history, architectural heritage preservation, and all of these sorts of things. And, you know, so which meant I was constantly thinking about what is the historical narrative that our built space is projecting, because our built spaces are monuments to something, to some sort of ideology. And so because of that, in my opinion, things like architectural heritage and preservation are forms of commemoration and recognition, and which is why I think I gravitated or stumbled into this conversation by accident. And so in thinking about that, and thinking about how when we choose to preserve a building or a built space, when we choose to preserve one built space over another, we are intentionally or unintentionally stating that the history, stories, memories, and ideologies associated with that built space are more important to our historical canon than another, or that we care more about it. And so with that background and experience, that's why my work currently is rooted in Scarborough, because in recent years, and sort of in the past few decades, there's been a lot of language around undesirability, or of how Scarborough is sort of, because it's a post-war suburb, you know, sort of a suburban wasteland. There's people like to use the term Scarberia in a sort of chiding way. It is essentially an assemblage of an urbanist's worst nightmares, and I'll give them that. But then when you couple that with the fact that modern day Scarborough, or residents of modern day Scarborough, are generally more racialized, generally lower income, generally have lower English or French capabilities, and are generally more vulnerable due to their migrant statuses, it creates this sort of, I mean, when you put that all together, you have all the ingredients to ensure that modern day Scarborough would be omitted from the sort of historical narrative that Toronto's larger built form projects. And so because of that, my work sort of focuses on future heritage, and, you know, it asks the question of what foundations do we need to lay now to ensure that modern day Scarborough is preserved or commemorated in a meaningful way in the future. And practically speaking, that means, you know, what kind of storytelling tools do we need to harness to empower people to leave those traces and tell those stories publicly, that will eventually become the evidence that, you know, becomes that historical research that, you know, becomes heritage one day in the future. And so it sort of empowering people to say, we are here, we care about these spaces, whether you think they're unremarkable or mundane. And so that brings me to my last point, which is that question of, you know, what histories do we want to, what do I want to see commemorated? And it really is those unremarkable, mundane histories that are wrapped in like an ugly suburban facade. You know, how do we commemorate the histories that are housed in a crumbling post-war concrete slab tower, or the food histories that are rooted in like a cookie cutter strip mall plaza with a huge parking lot. And I use the term unremarkable specifically because I don't like the rhetoric that people who are racialized or in these vulnerable positions need to be remarkable to have something to be proud of, because I don't think that standard is applied to other folks. And so I might be at time, so I'm going to stop talking now.
Thanks, Faison. First and foremost, you did not stumble into this panel by accident. You are here. Nothing is ever accidental. You were meant to be here in this great company. And, it's interesting when you talked about leaving the traces of stories. It made me think about something, that we've heard and something that I've been reflecting on as we go through this journey, which is, we tell the story sometimes from a single perspective. And how many perspectives there are on the same story, and being able to share the plurality of experiences people have around that moment that we're recognizing, that creature, that spirit, that whatever it is. And we don't often do that, and so, we name, we recognize, and we move on to something else. And to think of it as living and dynamic is a really beautiful thing. And I think it's a really hopeful thing, because our cities change and we change, and the stories that get recognized in community should evolve with it, but leave traces. So that's really beautiful. Thank you. Melanie, hopefully your cat is giving you some peace right now, and we can hand the floor to you.
I made a deal with one of my kids to come and entertain said cat. So he's been removed from the scene. He's cute, but disrupted. Thank you so much to the panelists who have gone before me. I will try to be brief. So I guess I'll respond to the two questions, but maybe not in a straightforward way. So I moved to Toronto more than 20 years ago to work at U of T. So I'm a professor of history at the University of Toronto. So I've lived here for more than 20 years. I had previously as a student lived in Montreal. Many members of my family were born here. I was not, but it's a part of my family. We're kind of, I guess, Barbadian Canadian. So I've lived here for many years and I have children here. I work here. It's now my home. And in my neighborhood, there's an alleyway near my house that was renamed some years back. I'm not going to say what the name of this alleyway is. While I want to share with the public, I'm not necessarily going to tell everyone exactly where I live, but this alleyway was renamed some years ago in memory of someone who lived in the neighborhood who used to go for walks there and who had recently passed away. And some years later, there was this beautiful moment where that person's family held a wedding in the laneway and shared it with the entire neighborhood. It was really wonderful. And I know this story because it happened in my time here while I lived in this neighborhood. Chances are a future resident of this neighborhood, or even someone who maybe moved in after this renaming happened and after this wedding happened, wouldn't know this story. But they can look it up and find the information now. It's available online. If you know the name of the laneway and you want to know where that name comes from, you can look it up online. There's no such information about the name of the street that I actually live on, which intersects with the laneway that I just mentioned. I've actually looked, I am a historian, I was curious, but there are no records, although I think the street has had this name for about a century, but it possibly was already a street before it was named. A lot of the houses here, including my house, were here before the street had a name. So at some point after the street was created, it seems, it received a name. And the person after whom the street was named doesn't seem to have been very prominent because I can't find any records about this person anywhere online, which is, in this day and age is telling since so much is now online. But what I can say without any doubt, I don't have to know exactly who this person was, but it is definitely the case that the street was not named after a woman. It was not named after an Indigenous person or any person of color, and certainly not a Black person. There are no Indigenous person or Black person or concept originating from Indigenous or African diasporic thought was thought as worthy of a street name in my neighborhood as the person after whom my street is named, who was certainly a white man who, it seems, did not do anything for which I can find a meaningful public record. So I've lived here for 20 years, and as I move through this city as a Black woman, I may not know where all the street names came from, but I am sent the constant message as I go about my everyday life that I am thought of by the state as an outsider or as a late arrival, even though Black people have been on this land for centuries. I've lived here for 2 decades, but I have rarely ever walked or driven on a street named after anyone who looks like me. This is not accidental, nor is it a reflection in any way of the actual importance of the presence of Black people in this territory. Absence is meaningful. Absence tells a story. And it is just as equally meaningful is resistance to the idea that the renaming of streets might be an important way of challenging practices of erasure. Absence reflects the ongoing reality of these practices of erasure, a constant reenactment of conquest, of genocide, of histories of enslavement, of histories of forced removal. It tells the story that Indigenous people and concepts no longer matter here, and that Black people who clearly are here only always ever just arrived. Renaming a street is not the same thing as deliberately removing a document from an archive, because often people will say, well, you're trying to change history. Renaming a street will not change history, right? It will not remove evidence of the history that happened. It does not change the past. Street names are a mirror, or place names are a mirror, a reflection in very crucial ways of how seriously we take our democratic values, and how we understand who and what gets to be reflected in the land, and which experiences and stories matter enough to be reflected. And thinking and rethinking those processes is an essential part of any serious democratic, community-centered process of reconciliation, redress, or repair. Names and streets, even though they're made of concrete, the streets themselves, or the names, they're not set in stone. They're not permanent. The names are meant to reflect experiences and change, just as the name of the street on which I live appeared at some point, right? Similarly, in our own time, we have to, just as there was a story being told about this place in the moment when that name was chosen, and it's a story that we may no longer reflect. I have no idea who this person was, but the names that we choose now are also a reflection of the kinds of stories that we want to tell in our own time and to transmit to the future about who we thought we were and who we aspired to be. So stories are what make us human, and they are what enable us to form communities. And it is a part of human communities to find ways to reflect those stories in the places where they live. It doesn't mean that the content of all those stories is meant to last forever, right? But it does mean that it's really essential that we engage in those kinds of conversations. And one of the, I think, really dangerous aspects of the place naming practices of colonialism is that colonial place naming was actually meant, in a sense, in a new kind of way, to eliminate those kinds of conversations, to try and prevent them from happening, to make it very difficult or to make it very uncomfortable to have those conversations. And it's that very practice of seeking to eliminate all other stories that we need to push back against. So I think it's not enough to just add names. I think we do have to be willing to have conversations about the names that are there. I think we have learned far more from the process of discussing and debating Dundas Street, for example. We've learned far more about who Dundas actually was than anyone seems to have learned from the street name in the 200 years that it was there unchallenged. So we need these stories to imagine who we can be, who we might be in the future, how things might be different, how things might be better. We need them to form healthy and safe communities. So that is what I will say. I hope that wasn't too long.
No, you were all so thoughtful and mindful about time. I should have given you more time because you all had such incredible reflections. And I was enjoying at the start of your talk, Bonnie was unapologetically doing the ums and ahs that I was doing on mute. Like it was just, we were feeling what you were saying. And you talked about erasure, and this is the thing, right? The names in our cities are intentional. They're not accidental. Someone named them. They are an act of intentionality. to recognize something. And for that reason, it does reflect where we are and who we are as a society. And, the piece I think that you touched on so many things, but I really got excited near the end when you were talking about who we can be. And that's something I think is really important. Everyone we spoke to, it actually kind of shocked me. I didn't expect it. People talked about, why don't we name things after children, right? If we want them to like see themselves in the city in the future, why don't we ever name things after kids to help them see themselves in their community and, change those names as the community changes and new kids become part of that. And so it's not just about the here and now, right? It's about envisioning, how we bring to life the values that we're re-envisioning for ourselves as a community, as a neighborhood, as a city. So thank you for that. And it's such a beautiful bridge to invite all of our panelists back into the conversation who've just been sort of holding all of your wisdom. And there's this tension, right? I think there is this tension and around, there's so many things we need for our city right now. There's so many systemic barriers that need to be dismantled. There are so many inequities and gaps that need to be closed. And so resources are required for everything, right? We need resources, we need money to do everything, whether it's renaming, whether it's building affordable housing, we need resources for that. Can each of you just reflect on sort of why does and you've each touched on it, but go a little deeper in why does naming matter when we're sitting in this tension of so many competing interests? As a city, why should we be thinking about putting our resources into naming and even renaming? And you can sort of take whichever perspective you'd like. And anyone who's feeling sort of ready to speak can jump in first. You could take a minute to reflect.
I'm happy to jump in first and get the conversation started. I think this question of competing priorities is interesting because I constantly think about it. I've worked in and around affordable housing, but then this is also like my work as well. So that question is constantly in my mind: is what am I doing? Why am I doing it? And I think the answer I always come back to with this is it's important and it's a priority because, like you said, these street names are intentional, and because of all of the conversations we've had, like they're important for certain reasons. And these structures are already in place. The infrastructure for naming these streets and these processes are already in place, and it's already happening, whether we say we care about it or not. And so I think what I have to say when people ask me this question is, the core question is, these things are already happening, but they're happening, from a colonial mindset and within a colonial framework. And the core question becomes, do we care about changing that, or do we care about stopping that? And I think for most people, the answer to that becomes yes. And that helps me sort of in my work, ground myself in why it's important and why it's a priority, thinking about the root of all of these names.
I see Bonnie and Elder Catherine.
Catherine, you go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Bonnie. I guess kind of in response to what I've been hearing, there's something that just keeps stirring for me again and again, and that is the notion of kind of unearthing the dead. And I hear the points about what we can be and how we can be in the future, but there are so many untold stories here in this part of the world that have not been acknowledged. There are peoples who have not been acknowledged. There's intersectionality between several Indigenous communities that has not been acknowledged. There are stories of dispersal and stories of, woe, and stories of, people being able to hold together in community during very, very difficult, challenging times. Those two are heroic journeys, but that's not the kind of heroism, if you will, the kind of emotional and community-based stability that people manage to hold together under extreme duress while the world around them is changing. And I think that those stories need to be exposed, unearthed, revealed,
Mm.
so that people have a chance to begin to know the complexity of the history of all of the peoples who have lived here. There is so much intersectionality between
Mm.
so many communities. And how do you kind of ride that wave, or where do you go in the wave? Do you go into the dip? Do you go up to the crest? Do you go, into the understory, into the current? Undawa is our word for current. I love that word because it just suggests so much. There's a lot under the surface that we don't normally touch. There are whole groups of people who were actively in this space, such as the Tianantate people who merged with the Wendat to become the Wyandot. These people, my people, are not referred to because we don't have legal status in Canada. These kinds of situations contribute to that sense of erasure. So really, from my point of view, it's extremely important to honor that ancestral kind of connection and awareness, and again, anchor us in those communities who have lived here for millennia, whose whose memories are present in the land, and whose descendants are also, the descendants of the trees that grew during that time are here now. So, focusing on them through our connectedness to the natural world, I think is an incredible way to again anchor that place in our community. Again, you're anchored in your community when you receive your clan name. We are just one clan among many, whether it's the clan of river beings or water guardians or clouds, or you could get really poetic about this, but
Mhm.
and or people, notable people. There are so many Indigenous clan mothers and women, strong women, who have not been acknowledged for their roles in history. There are intersectionalities between the Black and Indigenous community that don't often get acknowledged. Those women, those people who held great responsibility and positions of leadership. Do I think we need to channel our resources into that space? Absolutely. It's the understory of where we are, and that understory needs to be unearthed, in my opinion. Thank you.
There are layers of history. Yeah, Elder Catherine, it really, there are so many layers, and it, as you were talking, it just made me think that the ancestors are also present, right? Just because I think we're so tied to recognizing people in their human form versus their ancestral spiritual form. And they have a very present role. Bonnie.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine, for reminding us of those ancestors. What I wanted to say and to remind myself of are the children, because I began my remarks thinking of myself as a young girl here in Toronto, feeling like a problem. And I think, and I'm sad to say that there are children here in Toronto now who feel that way. And so in all those years, we haven't managed to tackle this. And it creates, it does create a problem if you think you're a problem. And so is it a good investment to make space for other faces, voices, and names? Yes. Why? Because a child, when they see themselves reflected admirably in the lived environment around them, feels good. And feeling good is, it makes good, you are giving kids the space to be themselves and to grow appropriately according to their gifts and their inclinations, and not to try to shovel themselves into a shoebox. And I think that this is such an important investment that a city can make, is in its youth and in the spaces that those youth can occupy. I was 40 years old before I had an Indigenous teacher in school. I'm a late bloomer, and I went to school late, to university late. But having an Indigenous instructor at the head of the classroom changed me on a molecular level. And I believe that this is the gift that every kid should have, that they see themselves reflected in positions of authority, in positions of honor and respect. And I don't think that making space for that, those respected people or citizens of the city who happen not to be from, white Europe, I don't think it harms. I think there is room in our collective understanding for all of those stories to sit side by side and all of those images to stand together. And it doesn't mean that we are canceling anyone or erasing anyone. We are acknowledging the tremendous breadth of humanity. And this is what I believe children need to see, and they need to learn to reflect in the world. And if Toronto has a gift to give out of the diversity that we have, surely it's something that's tied up with that, to celebrate our difference. Thanks, that's me, I'll shut up now.
Melanie, I don't know if you had anything to share on this, but no pressure to share on every question, of course.
Well, I feel like I can't really go after that. That was just
Yeah.
beautiful. Well, I mean, I guess to be just brief, there's so much one could say about why this is important. I think if we're going to acknowledge the kinds of violence that have happened here, as part of the architecture, institutional, but also physical of the place that we live in, then it's important to recognize, there is no sort of statute of limitations on genocide. We have to really be serious about thinking through what it means, and what it has cost us as a community of people to not acknowledge and to not attempt to repair that history. It costs us. It costs us in lives. It costs us in dreams. It costs us in possibilities. Just as we recognize that the kinds of climate crises that we face are in large part one of the consequences of colonialism, that loss is also a loss in languages. It's a loss in stories. And those also limit our ability. The fact that we have such a limited understanding of the richness of those stories fundamentally limits our ability to think about ways to address the problems that face us. So aside from, the fact that, this is a history we have to reckon with just on because it's a part of who we are, there is also a very real and much higher cost to not doing so.
I'm struck by something you said, which is, it made me think, that we can even lose our own stories, in thinking about Bonnie's experience. It's, in suppressing different parts of our identity to exist, some of your stories, we think they leave us. They're in us, but they leave our conscious mind. And I think part of this is a way to make sure that they're present in our conscious mind. And all of you have sort of pointed to the fact that, there are lots of things that we should be doing to close gaps of inequities, but this is the beginning of the journey of helping people see themselves in the city so that they can continue to feel a sense of connection and engagement. And it's the start of a healing process, a reconciliation process, a decolonizing process. It's a starting point. And there's much to come after it. And so as we think about this process, how should it feel? What should it be? I think that's also part of what we're exploring here tonight is, we've talked a little bit about the histories, but what should that process be like? And I'm thinking about these name giving traditions in different Indigenous communities and nations. And I'm thinking about, within intersectional communities that Elder Catherine mentioned, folks have ways, we spoke to folks in the trans community and for the Trans Day of Remembrance, there are specific things that are done to honor those who they've lost and honor those living and holding those histories. So how do we approach this? What should and could a process or processes look like as we go into naming and renaming?
Well, I'll just jump in if you don't mind. We have a Wyandot word, which is a very beautiful word, omakiesti, which I mentioned during the Thanksgiving address. And that word is about intentional gathering for a specific purpose. And so it's about drawing your attention in, coming together as diverse people, as diverse entities with diverse interests, and arriving at a place of consensual or consensus rather, to accomplish the task at hand. So for me, there's an automatic kind of predisposition to understanding that what you're doing is activating relationality for a specific purpose. And that, to me, makes it somewhat ceremonial in nature. It kind of bumps it over, in my way of thinking, into the realm of something that is potentially sacred because of the power of naming. And I don't like to use the S word, sacred, too much, because I think it's overused. And I think then it loses its importance. But these kinds of gatherings are activations. They are consciousness changing. There was a woman, Dion Fortune, who said, magic is the art of changing consciousness at will. And I do believe that when we kind of activate these ideas, we're in fact kind of sending these resonant vibrations out, if you will, all over the place that shift that consciousness, that collective consciousness. And so the act becomes highly symbolic. It becomes ceremonially significant. And you could also use words like it kind of sanctifies, if you will, a space in a new way. I'm trying to avoid certain kinds of terminology here. You know, we had a tradition of oiling people's scalps with sunflower oil as a way to connect them to the land and to honor them. This is kind of a similar thing as far as I'm concerned. It's a recognition of that which is becoming something that it already is, that we are recognizing that idea that already exists there. And that's why I think in Indigenous naming traditions, that concept of naming after land features and things like that is so beautiful, because it acknowledges what is. And with that comes reverence. And as far as I'm concerned, that's the one piece that is often missing in situations like this, is that we have to start with a foundational kind of reverent connectedness to each other, to the object at hand or the task at hand, and to our eventual outcome.
Connie.
Well, what I notice about street names specifically is that they're usually named after people. And for me, Melanie, you spoke about this, like, who is that person? What did they do? And how come they get a street named after them? And what I'd like to see is more reference to place, because, you know, this was a place where lots of stuff happened. And in Anishinaabe, Ojibwa Anishinaabe, in our language, most of the words aren't nouns, they're verbs. It's a very action-oriented language. And they talk about, you know, this is the place where the fish were, where, you know, the people fished, or the water was like this. And it describes the water, but it mostly describes what happened there. And I think that there's room in this placemaking kind of discourse for a shift in focus. And so a shift away from significant human beings, instead to the significance of the land or the water. And I mean, this is a city of ravines. We are a city of many, many rivers and creeks, and they're beautiful, and most of them are unnamed. And here's a perfect opportunity for us to avoid having to go through all of the bureaucratic, time-consuming and expensive process of changing street names, where we could name places and people could come to identify, as we would in our traditional and Anishinaabe tradition, we would identify the place where we are. And it would be in an Indigenous name. It could be in one of several Indigenous names. It could be a name that is significant to a particular community. So not necessarily an Indigenous community, but a place where newcomers gathered, or this was where everyone got off the boat, you know? I mean, I just think that we need to, or I would like us to begin to think more about what happened or what happens in a place, why a place is significant for gathering. Why do we remember it? What does it look like? The notion of reverence, what does it mean to us? And how does it make us feel when we're there? All of those things to me could sit side by side with a more colonial matrix of grids and streets and avenues and all of that. It could fit in a more poetic way that follows the contours of this place that we're in.
Elder Catherine.
Bonnie, it reminds me of your beautiful mural at the McMichael Gallery right now, which has all of those beautiful rivers, spaces, trails, a specific trail lying on top of the grid lines of, you know, that were under the painting. I'm kind of struck by what you've said because it mirrors that so beautifully. So there can be room for that kind of layering of understandings. I think that was very eloquently put, and as I said, called to mind your mural immediately. So thank you for that.
Melanie, you're unmuted. Oh, I thought you wanted to jump in.
No, that was completely accidental.
Well, Bonnie, as you were speaking, you know, it felt like I could feel my body expand, like it, you know, the way you described what happens in a place and why do we remember it, I could feel an expansion. Like I even sort of felt like I'm sitting back a little as I say it, because where you're talking about hold space for so many of us, right? That we can go to a place and recognize how many different ways in which we use or engage with the space, and you're creating space. And I think that's, you know, so many folks think that there's attentions that we're limiting space, and the way that you know, I'm hearing you reflect on it is that it's accommodating even more, because what we remember of a place is so personal, so connected to our ancestors and connected to our realities. Yeah. I'm looking at our Q&A. Oh, Faison, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in, and I look at this question from a different sort of angle again, because I'm looking at it in the context of like newcomers, people who don't have the sort of long lineage on this land. And again, specifically my work is about Scarborough, and just thinking about the idea of process of commemoration, and a big inspiration for my work, and I just wanted to sort of mention it out loud, was this. It's an Instagram page called Scarborough's Thoughts, which is just, you know, some guy decided that there are spaces in our community that he wanted to share on Instagram. And it sort of snowballed into this sort of community-driven commemoration page, essentially, where people were sharing their joy and their nostalgia about this space, and sort of, you know, despite all of the negative mainstream narrative that you hear about it. And I think sort of harnessing that shared joy is really important as well. If we're thinking about the future of commemoration, like what should the city be looking for to indicate, okay, what might become history, or what might be worth, having a conversation about. And it manifests in different ways. One of the things, it started as an Instagram page, and then it also became like they have a partnership with the Scarborough Health Network, and they're making t-shirts and all of these sorts of things that aren't like static plaques and names. These are things that people live in and breathe in every day. I think those are also like that's part of the commemoration process, and I think that's important to think about too. So I'm gonna throw that in there.
I love Scarborough Spots. It's a great account. Well, I think that's such a nice transition to this question we have from an anonymous attendee, Faison, because, I think part of the beauty of what you're talking about with Scarborough Spots is that it's crowdsourced, it's community generated, it's collective storytelling. And I think that I hope that maybe this panel, I think, would agree that we need to also expand who's participating in this process. I think maybe I can assume that we might all agree on that. And, folks from a wide range of intersectional communities, like Elder Catherine was referring to, should and could be part of a process of naming and renaming in our city and community. So I'm looking at this question from our anonymous attendee who has asked, how do we maintain and sustain community relationships and involvement long-term in long-term engagements like advisory groups focused on naming and commemoration? How do we keep people involved over the long term? Can we keep people involved over the long term too? Melanie.
Yeah, well, I will, just speaking as, I guess, from the experience that I've had just over the last few months as co-chair of the Dundas Street Renaming Committee with the amazing Elder Catherine. I'm not a city planner, certainly. I'm not in government, but I think the process, certainly for us, our experience on that committee, the process sometimes of even if someone suggested a name, for example, and then thinking about, okay, we need to learn about this name. How do we go about learning about this name? Who do we need to be in conversation with in order to find the information that we need about this concept or this person or this event? And just that process actually of having to ask those questions then started to shape, well, yeah, but who's involved in the conversation and in what ways? And so I think that the idea, the recognition that historically, the names of the streets or the names of places in the city have undergone change in response to a number of different factors over time. That doesn't mean you're revisiting this every year. It doesn't mean that, in 5 years, you won't know the name of the street you're driving down, nothing like that. But the recognition that that is part of how communities evolve and thrive, right, is to, over time, rethink some of those names, right, and what they reflect. And if they still reflect what they need to reflect or what we'd like them to reflect. That helps to shape processes. So I think it's really essential that the government of the city see it as part of its mandate, in fact, to encourage those conversations, but to encourage them in ways that do not simply allow those who have, I guess, felt traditionally as though power was meant to reflect them. That it is not just a process of ensuring that the same kinds of voices are heard over and over again. But that has to be, and these are some of the aspects of the principles that we're discussing, that does have to be a commitment to part of how governments run, right? So there are assumptions that are embedded in governance, about, say, public safety, about the provision, at least in our own time, of certain public goods. And it's really important that governments recognize that protecting these kinds of processes of street naming or place naming, so that they do and can involve large numbers groups of people who have not traditionally been part of that conversation, that's actually a really important part of good governance. So what that may look like in terms of a specific process may not always be the same, but the principle itself should be central to what a government understands itself to be doing.
Requires us to move at the speed of trust a little, you know. Like I think it requires also a shift in the default, in the government default, which is if folks don't see themselves in those power structures, it might take a little bit longer to build those relationships in order to be able to do all the things you're talking about. So there's even a step zero snuck in there.
But I think I agree with you. I do love that expression, to move at the speed of trust, but it also does, I think, also reflect a sense that you do have to protect that principle from actors who don't respect it, who actually fundamentally do not respect the presence of underrepresented voices.
Yes.
Who want to keep certain voices underrepresented. That it's actually really important that governments recognize that is, you're not necessarily there just to allow some kind of free-for-all that will then allow, those who actually do not respect a democratic process to take control, right? That's not what this is about.
Elder Catherine?
I was just thinking about a new publication, and I'm not doing this to plug my own work, but there's a new book out called Sacred Civics, and it's talking about building 7th-generation cities. And I happen to have a chapter in the book, which is great, which is about reclaiming agency through wonder, which is kind of about connecting to the land in the ways that Bonnie was referring to, and also other Indigenous naming practices. But again, I keep getting back to this point of reverence and a spiritual connection that kind of trumps, if you'll pardon my use of that particular word, notions of superiority over nature, over natural processes, over natural law, if you will, where we commit to kind of acknowledging all of the ways in which we have damaged the place where we live, and we seek to reconcile ourselves to heal the land. And those activations also are prime ground, prime earth for change, and for reinvesting in naming practices that seek to heal and create holism rather than a fractured kind of reality. But again, that involves people kind of accepting the notion that they might not be more powerful than a waterfall or a stream or a tree, and stepping back and allowing the natural world to be advocated for in that way. I think, the more I think about it, other than naming groups of people, my mind kind of runs to the notion that perhaps we should just not consider naming anything after anybody except components of the natural world. And that maybe it will take a few generations for us to kind of put our priorities back in what I perceive to be, might be a better place. Thank you.
I'm going to go to Faison, then Bonnie.
Okay. So I wanted to share a reflection specifically about the point that little dialogue that Melanie and Zara you both had. The idea of like moving at the speed of trust, and because one of the challenges I've encountered in my work is addressing the apathy around names, because in my community of people who are newcomers and people who, how should I phrase this? It's people who are neither the sort of holders of power in the colonial sense, and the ones who are reflected in the current place names, nor are we the people who are directly affected or had violence enacted upon by the people whose names are represented. We had our own colonial violence, but that was sort of separate from this land in a lot of ways. And so what happens there because of that is a distinct lack of one, understanding of what these names are, and two, people just tend not to care about, you know, the process. And so the step zero, you know, that idea of moving into the speed of trust, I think part of that challenge is addressing the apathy, and part of that, because it gets a circular process, because until people see themselves reflected in those names, they don't realize necessarily the power they have. And so, do I have an answer to this? No, but like that's just a reflection of mine. Because I think about my younger brother, who, you know, I study urbanism and he doesn't. And when I talk to him about names, he's like, "Why are we talking about this? I don't care." But then he and his friends have like their own place names for all of the, like, I'll tell him a street and he's like, "I don't know what that street is," but then he has a name for it when I show it to him on the map based on his sort of cultural upbringing and whatever those values are. I don't actually know why those names exist. But yeah, those are that's my reflection.
That's such a great point, Faison. And that point around, we do call places by other names in our communities in colloquial way, in like colloquial, informal ways. Yeah, and those names matter, but people don't realize it. Bonnie.
Yes, informality and fun and story. How do we get people engaged who don't care? Well, we ask them to tell us their stories.
Yeah.
And they'll come out, and they're wonderful stories, and they come from many, many communities, individuals, memories, fantasies. I mean, all of this stuff is culture, right? That's what culture is. And I think that if we make it too dry and too official and too kind of stratified and too authoritative, people don't care. But if you make it into something that is about telling our stories and seeing them out there and laughing about them, talking about them, crying about them, that's culture. And that makes the city live, you know. And those funny names that we give, you know, we give them to that corner store, we give them, you know, to our school, all of those things, those are layers and layers of story. And I just think we need to find a way to sing those stories, tell those stories, you know, have them out there. And then gradually the names will emerge, you know, people, they'll catch on because they're so smart and so true, you know, truer, much truer than Yonge Street, you know, the name Young. Who was Mr. Young? Well, I don't know. But, you know, there's something else that we call Yonge Street. And maybe that should be privileged in some way that doesn't depose Mr. Young and his supporters, but that allows it to breathe a bit better. Anyway, thank you.
You answered the next question that was emerging after Faison, you know, Faison's remarks, which was like, so how do we inspire people to care? And Bonnie, I think you really precisely sort of articulated it, which is we broaden the conversation. We asked people about their stories, and it made me think of a story we heard from a young artist recently, whose story was about recognizing a mushroom that was really connected to the layers of their life, like this particular mushroom that had lots of little layers, and it felt like the thing they wanted to recognize. And so when we open that space, we give space to people to share about the land, right? And that as such a place of unity in the things that we all recognize formally and informally.
Yeah, I think this question of, you know, inspiring people, I think it actually goes back to an earlier question that was posed about, you know, is it too expensive, or is it worth the money, or is it, you know,
Mm-hmm.
I think again the question is, you know, we look at some of the rates of civic participation, you know, and clearly they're not at the present moment consistently what one would wish in a sort of healthy democratic sort of environment, right? A lot of people feel very disengaged. And we have to really think, okay, what are some of the reasons why that might be? what does it do to a culture of civic engagement when most people are made to feel from the day they are born in a place that a lot of the decisions about that place, including what things are named, they have no say in, right? So I think transforming that culture really does begin literally in the spaces that we walk through. It creates a very different relationship to place if people are, raised to see themselves as being part of an ongoing conversation about the stories of the place in which they live. So I think in addition to the question of like, how do we inspire people is, again, what is the cost that we have borne and continue to bear of not adopting some of these fairly obvious ways or looking at some of the fairly obvious places for the sources of disengagement, right? If people don't feel like they are part of crafting the stories of their place, then it's kind of hard to move on from there, right? They will look for engagement in other places where they feel like they matter, right? So, and that's not necessarily always civic. If that message is sent that they have a very narrow space in which their voice matters.
It's connecting to another question and reflection from an anonymous attendee who asked, how are we preventing contemporary forms of displacement such as gentrification processes? And the piece that relates to this specifically is, how can we preserve their heritage and protect communities from becoming invisible as a result of these contemporary displacement practices? And as you were speaking, Melanie, I was thinking about this question too, right? It's like, how do we expect people to feel a sense of belonging where maybe a place that they felt a sense of belonging gets taken away in, a variety of different forms, and a variety of different mechanisms. And I think what you're talking about is so important. We are getting close to the end. You all are putting out so much beautiful wisdom at this time of the evening. So I'm going to ask you for one more burst of energy before we bring this to a close. And just, broadly, I think you've had a chance to hear each other speak and reflect on each other, and just some closing reflections to folks who are, we're going into a season where this is going to be talked about, and it might be in the news, and there's all sorts of things bubbling up into the mindsets of Torontonians around naming and renaming. So just a closing reflection and anything you would offer to someone listening in who is thinking about how they can engage with this in a way that's positive and constructive and collective. Anything you'd offer to them to think about? And anyone can go first.
I'll jump in if you don't mind. It's been a pleasure listening to everybody with their wonderful viewpoints and stories to share, and also their pragmatism and incredible powers of observation. It's been amazing working with Dr. Melanie on the committee. And I have to say that really one of the most impressive aspects of this, I think, is the ways in which community come together to have these lengthy discussions, and how patient they are, and how we must encourage and support that kind of patience and discussion, and not rush toward meeting agendas and possibly deadlines that are too short, that we give people time to kind of unpack all of the narratives and then put the whole thing back together again in a way that suits the community. In our community, we have an idea called showing face. You can't mail order a ceremony. You have to go and be in community and sit with people and work it through, day after day after day until you get where you want to be. So in that way, this has been kind of that beautiful exchange of ideas and thoughts that, push people forward or move them in perhaps more into the center, so that they can find what they need to find to achieve their goal. But I really want to say also that that kind of respectful kind of process is something that really needs to be encouraged and supported and fostered in the city and in all cities, I believe. And that's what, makes civics a really happening thing, right? Thank you very much, everybody. It's been wonderful.
Faison.
I mean, I don't want to be the last person to speak, so that's why so first of all, I would just like to say my face physically hurts from smiling so much. This has been such a wonderful conversation. This is really great. But secondly, I just want to, my closing remarks, I just want to say something that I think I would have needed to hear as someone new entering this conversation. And it's that, you and your journey in your life is history in the making. And I think it's important to understand that we make the city what it is, whether it chooses to acknowledge us or not. So I think it's perfectly within our power to advocate for ourselves. And I think it's important that we advocate for ourselves, even if the space you live in isn't, the space that you dreamed of. I still think it's worth care because you're here and your story is worth telling. So I'm just gonna leave those words there.
Thanks, Faison. Bonnie.
Well, I'm thinking about Toronto, and of course, Toronto sees itself as this gigantic thing, this big object, or I don't know, structure. And I think actually, to me anyway, Toronto is a series or a collection of villages and smaller areas that people live in, and I've kind of walked on and owned and all that stuff. And I think part of the size of the city is daunting for people, and it sets up a us versus them kind of thing when the them, which is the city, doesn't even really exist. Like it's all quite fictional. And so I think that breaking down the conversation into smaller units and taking smaller self-identified villages within the city, and allowing, remembering that and recognizing actually that the history of Toronto, the history of Southern Ontario is very much about this. It's about confederations of cities. And once we start, teaching that Indigenous history properly in our schools, everyone will know that. This land is made up of a multitude and layers of confederated villages, and they call themselves nations. And this kind of thing where you name yourself like a nation, and it doesn't mean that you're going to take over City Hall, or you're going to deconstruct the municipal bylaws of this place or anything like that, but it becomes a kind of tenant of citizenship, of civics, as Catherine was saying, of a way that we are with one another and the way that we care for one another and our communities. And out of that, those names will come. And yeah, I just think we have to think of ourselves in different ways collectively, and organize ourselves in different ways. And I think the city has a role to play, and maybe in doing that. I'm not sure what that role is. I mean, this is the part that gets very tricky, is how does that look politically? But I think there's something very, very valuable in recognizing the fact that certain places, many places in Toronto are actually villages.
Beautiful. Melanie, final words. You're on mute.
Finally had that Zoom moment. I managed to avoid it for an hour and a half. I think we have to recognize, like we are often taught in a way, to see everything that kind of happened before, in a way, colonialism as this sort of long static, like the rest of the world is just sort of sitting there waiting for history to start when, I don't know, colonialism arrives. And actually, if we look at, longer histories of human civilizations, they're very complex, but some of the longest lasting and most enduring civilizations are the ones where you've had social structures that are open to change, open to being challenged, and that are open to adapting not just people into their communities, but what they bring, their ideas. And as I think, if we, I think about the sort of the land acknowledgement that we opened with, or that my kids listen to, and is recited in school every day, my children's schools. And if we are to take that seriously, we really do have to start with these stories, and to start with the recognition that we need more stories in order to learn from all of those societies, not just the empires, the Romans and so on. We need more of these stories of how human beings have in fact built resilient communities that didn't, within the very short space of time, in the modern colonial era, lead to the kind of crises that we are facing now, right? People did do that. People had strategies for how to do that. And we need to relearn those stories. And this question of what it is that we commemorate in the spaces in which we live, by the names that we give them and the values that we assign, this is the place where we start unpacking those stories and figuring out how we can turn them into new ways of living, right?
Beautiful. Thank you. What a close. Beautiful. So
The
while
pressure.
oh no, you brought us together. That was amazing. So as I'm just sharing some closing remarks, I would invite any participant who is here. We haven't been able to hear the chatter, and if possible, can you put like an emoji, a word of gratitude, something in the Q&A so our panelists can feel your energy? I don't know how that works, but if you can, put a word of gratitude, put an emoji, anything that you feel. I just want to say really quickly, I think we talked about how naming matters, right? We talked about how it helps us be in relationship to our ancestors, how it helps us cultivate a sense of belonging with each other and with the creatures and with the energies, and to feel of good mind in our villages, and then to really step into who we can be with all of that. And I think that was important context, that helps us understand who we can be. And so I'll close with tons of gratitude for Elder Catherine, for Bonnie, for Faison, and for Melanie for sharing all of your great ideas, your wisdom, and your experiences. And I just want to close, with this quote from a youth artist who said, I think we just need to begin and end with the land. And as I'm listening to all of you, it really does feel that way, that the land is holding so many histories and stories and futures. And it's such a great gateway into building a connected story. So thank you for all of this tonight. If you are interested in staying connected to the recognition review, Ariel has generously put the email address in the chat, email recognitionreview@toronto.ca, to stay connected and share ideas and reflections, questions. And thank you for all of your time, and everyone who listened in tonight. It was really great to have you all together. Thanks, everyone.
Mm.